Well, I don't know how many of you in here have ever taught a Bible class. I don't know how many of you in here have ever preached. But you know it's kind of interesting before you come and stand in the pulpit if somebody threatens you. And I've been threatened by this lesson tonight that, I'm talking about the great events of the Bible, and I announced I was going to be talking about the intertestamental period. Nona told me she was going to have, when I announced that 2 weeks ago, that she was going to have a trap door put in for tonight. I guess Jeff could get that done. If I wasn't going to preach the Bible, she'd just have the trap door opened up and I'd follow it through. And then one of the college young men said to me before service this night, was teasing me about not preaching the Bible tonight, so I'm in trouble this evening. I want to welcome all of you, and delighted you're here, and to those who might be watching our live streaming, I want to welcome you as well. And it's always interesting for you in the congregation here to just know there are many, many services that we do that I will get a message very soon after that service is over from somebody who's been worshiping with us, maybe sick and in some other town, and so it's a very good blessing that we have, and we're glad that we can do that and have an opportunity for others to participate with us as we worship. For those of you who haven't been here, we've been doing a study of some of the great events of the Bible, and we started in Genesis 1, and in the last lesson, we saw the work of Ezra and Nehemiah, which ultimately gets all the things about the temple, the area around the temple, the walls of the city of Jerusalem rebuilt. And then all of a sudden, if you're reading the Bible and you're reading it chronologically, all of a sudden we end the Old Testament and we jump to the New Testament and don't realize sometimes that between Malachi and the events of the life of Jesus are 400 years, sometimes called a period of silence by some who study the Bible. Sacred Scripture tells us nothing about the history of the Jewish people from the days of Nehemiah until the beginning of the New Testament. And so it's, I think, important that we stop and say, really, 400 years? What happened in those 400 years? It's also, I think, easy for us to say, well, why talk about that? Because there's nothing God revealed to us, so why does it matter? We don't need to study that. Well, I hope you hang on tonight. I'd like if you would open your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 1, first of all. I better use a verse so I won't get in trouble with Nona tonight. Ephesians chapter 1, you know that Ephesians is talking about the greatness of the church. And I want to start with verse 7. In Him, obviously Jesus, in Him we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of His grace, which He made to abound toward us in all wisdom and prudence, having made known to us the mystery of His will. What hasn't been made known before that all of a sudden now has been made known, according to the good pleasure which He purposed in Himself, that in the dispensation of the fullness of the times He might gather together in one all things in Christ, both which are in heaven and which are on earth in Him. Watch it. The Godhead had a plan in eternity. And that plan was to gather everything, here the context obviously, to gather Jews and Gentiles, to have them together in one place, in one body, you and I know as we look at the New Testament, in the church. To gather Jews and Gentiles together in the church. But watch what he said, in the dispensation of the fullness of times. When God looked out in the annals of all of history before the world began and said, here's the time when everything's going to be just right to bring Jesus into the world. What you and I are going to look at tonight is why was it in the first century that everything was perfected when God would say, here's the fullness of the dispensation of times, here's the time to bring Jesus into the world. It's an awesome thing to look at. Now, I want you now to turn back to Daniel, if you will, because I want to remind you that there were powerful empires and there were providential events that came together for the perfect time for Jesus to come into the world. And I start this by asking us to remember a prophecy. Remember a prophecy back in Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar saw that great image in a dream. He had no idea what the dream meant. In fact, couldn't even remember the dream. And the wise men were called. They couldn't tell him what it was, certainly couldn't interpret. And so Daniel is called, and Daniel tells him about that dream and what the interpretation of the dream was. And if you remember, he tells him that this is about 4 great world empires. Notice verse 31. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. The image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became the great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, later in this chapter, over in verse 44, he talks about what's going to happen in the days of this 4th empire. In the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. Now, in this chapter, as well as in succeeding chapters, for example, chapter 8 in this book of Daniel, there are prophecies concerning 4 great and succeeding empires. Here they are. Nebuchadnezzar was told, you're the head, you're the first empire. Your empire is going to fall. We've studied about that. And it fell to the Medo-Persian Empire. We talked about the Persians when we studied Ezra and Nehemiah. That empire is going to fall to the Greek Empire. And the Greek Empire was going to fall to the Roman Empire. But as Daniel was giving this message to Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian Empire was the empire that existed when Nebuchadnezzar ruled. Well, we've talked about that, so I'll not give more information about that one tonight, but then you come to the Persian Empire. He talks about that in chapter 2, verse 39, and also in chapter 8, verses 3, 4, and 20. Remember that Daniel prophesied about these 4 successive world empires, Babylon the first, and then a second one, the Medo-Persian Empire, is going to come, and it defeated Babylon. From Cyrus the Great, 539 BC, until Alexander, that is, he's a Greek, till he overthrew Persia in 336, Persia was a great empire. And during that time, the Jews, and I want you to follow this very carefully, during that time the Jews were sent back to Jerusalem, as we've been studying. The temple was rebuilt, and the dilapidated city of Jerusalem and its wall were reconstructed. You remember we've studied the events of the lives of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Esther and Nehemiah. All of those events occurred in the days of the Persian Empire. And Malachi, the last prophet inspired by God of the Old Testament, wrote around 400 BC. Now, I want to stop there just a moment and go backwards and make a tie. Let me ask you a question. What empire was it that overthrew the 10 northern tribes of Israel? That was Assyria, right? That's important for you to keep in mind. Now, what happened when Assyria was overthrown? Who overthrew them? Babylon. I want you to keep this in mind. When Babylon overthrew Assyria, they, in essence, took control of those 10 northern tribes that had been captured in 721 BC. Now they go and attack Jerusalem and overthrow it in 606, 599, and 586. And now they control the 2 southern tribes, Judah. And so guess what? Babylon now controls all 12 tribes. I've heard people talk about the 10 lost tribes as if the 10 tribes just went into non-existence. Not true. There was a remnant of those people who existed, and yes, we're even down there in the times of the first century. So it's important when you see God's providence, Assyria takes the 10 tribes, Babylon comes along, overthrows them, now they've got control of the 10, and then they overthrow Judah, now they have control of a remnant of all 12 of those tribes. Alexander the Great overthrew Persia in 326 BC. And as I said earlier, the Bible says nothing about the history from Malachi until the Roman Empire reigns and Jesus is born, that period of the silence. Now, somebody might say, as some of you have said, why in the world do we need to study this period of the silence? It's not in the Bible. Oh. But brethren, the events during this time show to lead up to that very important time when that fullness of time had come, and God says it's now the right time to bring the Messiah into the world. Now, that's going to happen along with the new covenant that he brings, and the old one is going to be nailed to the cross. Now, the next empire that we study about is the Greek Empire. It's the third world empire prophesied by Daniel back in chapter 2 and chapter 8. This empire existed from about 359 BC to 63 BC. Philip of Macedon was the first ruler, but the ruler that's really known in the Greek Empire is a man called Alexander the Great. He was a terrific ruler of an empire, but some things you ought to know about him. He came to power when he was 20 years old. He ruled for 13 years. And in that 13 years, Alexander the Great conquered Greece, Asia, Egypt, Syria, and Persia. His desire was that he was going to promote the Greek culture in the whole world. And he did promote it in Egypt and in Western Asia. By the way, what Alexander the Great did helped to unite the East and the West that would ultimately set the table, if I can call it that way, for Christianity's spread. This man and what happened in the Greek Empire was critical to what we're going to jump down and see when we come to the first century. He died of a fever at age 32 in 323 BC. But folks, the Greek influence upon Palestine is seen in a number of ways. Number one, and this is a big one, the Greek language became so influential, in fact, in the first century, almost like today. You know, you go somewhere in the world, and many of us in this room have been to the former Soviet Union, and what do people want their children to learn? They want them to learn English. Why? Because English is kind of seen like the universal language of today. That's exactly what Greek became in the first century. And Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire tried to promote Hellenization, which is they wanted to promote the Greek language, architecture, and art. And it permeated Jewish society and culture and lifestyle. Let me give you some examples, just a couple quickly. But names were changed from Judah to Judea, and from the Edomites to the Edomites. All of that occurred because of some of this impact of Greek culture upon the Jewish people. And of course, one of the biggest things when I mention the concept here of the Greek language is Koine Greek, which was in essence the Greek not of classical Greek, but rather the Greek of the common man, became such a universal language that people all throughout the nations in the first century were able to read and understand this Koine Greek. That's critical to what's going to happen when God says the time's right. Now, there's something else, though, that happened after Alexander the Great died. And this happened so many times in empires. Because when he died, 4 of his generals took over the land in the empire. And by the way, you see some of this prophesied back in Daniel 8:8. I want you all to get a picture of this. Palestine changed hands 5 times in the 20 years after Alexander's death. Can you imagine? Can you imagine living in a country and 5 different rulers come in and overthrow each other and are seeking power, and you're like this little domino here just being flipped this way and that way? You don't like it. One of these rulers was named Ptolemy. He ruled over Egypt. Another one of these rulers is named Seleucus. He ruled over Babylon. And early on, after Alexander's death, the Ptolemies controlled Palestine. That was from 323 to 204 BC, so about 120 years. Now, listen to what Ptolemy did that had an impact on Jewish culture. This man controlled Alexandria, Egypt, which became one of the great learning centers in the world and promoted the Greek language. This control, because he controlled Egypt and Palestine, Ptolemy reached out to the Jews and encouraged them to come to Egypt and to study the Greek language. Guess what? You're getting the influence out of Hebrew and into the Jewish language that's going to be important for the time the Messiah comes. You had another ruler after him named Ptolemy Philadelphus, who invited the Jews to come to Egypt and brought almost 1 million Jews out of Palestine and into Egypt. By the way, this man led in the translation of the Old Testament from the Hebrew language into the Greek language. How many of you have heard of this book, the Septuagint? By the way, if you're reading something about the Bible in the Old Testament and somebody notes something and they use these Roman letters, LXX, 70, that is a denotation of the Septuagint. And this guy, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was responsible for having 70 scholars to be called together in Egypt to produce a Greek translation of the Hebrew text. That's huge, because these Jews who've only been able to read the Old Testament scriptures in the Hebrew, now they're going to be available in Greek, and that's going to have huge impact in the next 300 years. This, by the way, also had huge impact in the synagogue where they came to read the scriptures. Huge impact that happened in the next 300 years. And thus, when the new covenant was given, it was written in the language of commerce and of the common people, Koine Greek. Think about it. What's happening here by Ptolemy Philadelphus is preparing the way so the New Testament, most of it is written in Koine Greek. The fullness of time, folks. But Ptolemy's domination of Palestine ended with the defeat of them by the Seleucids at Caesarea Philippi. Now I'm going to jump over here to the Seleucids for a few moments. They had been over Syria. And some of these guys you've probably never heard much about. I'm going to tell you just a little about them, but there's one of these men that's huge in this study. One of the guys is Seleucus Nicator. He was another one of Alexander's generals. Remember, you had 4 generals. He's a second one of them, who founded Antioch of Syria, controlled most of Asia, and began to promote the God of the Jews and encourage the Jews to come out of their land in Palestine and to come and to be in the lands of Syria. So here's this man trying to have impact upon the Jews. Now, he's followed by a man named Antiochus III. This guy defeated Ptolemy Philopator in 217 BC. He defeated the Ptolemies and took control of Palestine in 198 BC. And this man, the Jews liked him. He lowered their taxes. He allowed the Jews to live by their own laws instead of, you got to follow the law that's of my country. But he was followed by another guy, and this is a man, if you don't know about him, haven't heard about him, you need to study some about him. His name is Antiochus IV. He's called Antiochus Epiphanes. That means the manifested one. This guy came to power in 175 BC. He recaptured Palestine, and by the way, some of you are going to say, Antiochus Epiphanes, I can't say the word, who cares? Well, let me give you something to think about. God, in the book of Daniel, prophesied about this guy. If you're taking notes, make note of these verses. Chapter 8, verses 9 to 11, and verses 22 to 25. This Antiochus Epiphanes was an evil man. And his first act, when he became the ruler over Palestine, he went and removed the Jewish high priest, Onias. He ended the long line of high priests from the tribe of Levi and the family of Aaron and just cut that off, and he sold the priesthood to a man named Jason. He was not of the family of Aaron. This man began to adopt Greek culture in Israel. And this Jason was then tricked by his brother, who purchased the priesthood and sold the golden vessels of the temple. Now, make some ties. Remember, a lot of those things have been in the hand of the Babylonians, and remember, Ezra and Nehemiah brought a lot of that stuff back. Now this guy comes along and takes these vessels of the temple in order to pay tribute money. But it's important that you know Antiochus Epiphanes for this reason, because when we come to the New Testament, we're going to read about these kinds of regions: Judea, Samaria, Galilee, Trachonitis, and Perea. This man Antiochus Epiphanes was responsible for setting all those up. Here was a man who tried to force the Greek culture upon Palestine. By the way, that's probably not a good idea when you read about the Jewish people and somebody trying to force something on them. This man declared himself to be the human manifestation of Zeus, the chief Greek god. Idols were placed throughout the land of Palestine. And in 171 BC, Antiochus invaded Egypt. And while he was in Egypt, it was reported in 168 that he'd been killed in battle. Now, this is a neat story. Remember, he's left Palestine, he's gone down into Egypt, and a report gets out. You know what happened? He was down in Egypt, and he's been killed. The Jews rejoiced. There was rejoicing in the city of Jerusalem. This evil guy that we hate is dead. Well, there was only one problem. He wasn't dead. And when you know this man's evil heart, when he heard about it, he returned with his army and devastated Jerusalem. In fact, 40,000 Jews were slain in one 3-day battle. This guy, there was another man there who led him into the Holy of Holies in the temple, and listen what this man did. You think about this, folks. This Antiochus Epiphanes destroyed the scrolls of the law. He offered a sow, a pig, on the sacred altar at the temple. Think about what that means to the Jews. He made a broth with that meat and sprinkled everything in the temple. Do you realize he's going to take water where this meat has been cooked, and he's going to, in essence, contaminate everything in that temple. He's going to sprinkle all of it with this water that's been contaminated by this pig meat. He defiled the most sacred parts of the Jews, their very religion. It was the ultimate of all desecrations to them. And by the way, remember in Daniel 9, verse 27, when you read about the abomination of desolation? That's what this is talking about. Well, he then erected an altar to Jupiter, to Zeus at the temple. He forced the Jews to eat pork, and temple worship ceased for 3 years. This man's goal was one. He was determined he was going to obliterate the Jewish religion from the face of the earth. Evil, evil man. But, as you can imagine, the Jews reacted very violently to this. And so, the Jews' bitterness and rebellion during the time of the Seleucids, Jewish loyalists called Hasidim, and the Hellenistic Jews resisted Greek culturalism. By the way, when we get to the New Testament, we're going to talk about some groups of Jews. One of them is Pharisees. The Pharisees are an outgrowth of these Hasidim who had such hatred in their hearts for Antiochus Epiphanes and these Greeks and what they had done. These Hellenistic Jews still followed the law of Moses, but some of them are at least willing to adopt some of Greek culture. Well, there was a guy named Mattathias. He was a Jew, and his 5 sons, and they rebelled against all of this sacrilege of Antiochus Epiphanes. They fled to the hills of Judea. They called for zealous patriots to join the rebellion, and this led to a group of people that's called the Maccabees, who ultimately drove those Syrians out of Palestine. And the Maccabees are an important group of people when you come to the history of the Jewish people. So I'll go there next. The Maccabees were from 165 to 63 BC. This man, Mattathias, who had these 5 sons, Furious at the atrocities of Antiochus Epiphanes, he and his sons opposed these Seleucids, as I mentioned, ran to the hills, and they became men who were called as zealots. By the way, have you all ever heard of a zealot? Remember one of the Lord's apostles, Simon the Zealot? His early years was being one of those folks. This man Matthias was followed by his son Judas Maccabees. He began waging guerrilla warfare upon the Seleucids. He defeated Antiochus Epiphanes in 3 battles, and Judas Maccabees retook Jerusalem in 164 and became the new governor of Palestine. This man purified the temple. He rededicated it. This instituted, by the way, the Feast of Dedication. How many of you have ever heard of that Jewish feast, Hanukkah? That's where it comes from, in this rededication of the feast, when Judas Maccabees leads this revolt. Well, there are a lot of things that happen after that. The Syrian hostilities rose again. They killed Judas. The leadership of this movement fell to his brother Jonathan from 161 to 143. He was killed shortly after becoming a leader. And then another guy, Simon, in 143 to 135. And this man's important because, watch what's happening. This man, Simon, appealed to Rome for help. And this brought a connection between the Jews and the Roman government. He was succeeded by his son John Hyrcanus, and there were some men called Hasmonean rulers, John Hyrcanus, and I'll not mention these other 5, but they get us from 135 down to 63 BC. Now, that gets us to the end of where you have the influence of these Greeks upon Palestine. That leads us to the Roman Empire. Because Daniel had prophesied about a 4th empire in the book of Daniel, chapter 2, and the Roman Empire, we're going to see what happened in 63 BC. I want to start with this statement. If you haven't read much about Rome, I would encourage you to do some, to study its history. Because Rome was a republic before it became an empire. You would find it intriguing today if you studied about Rome in its early years as a republic, and it would sound very much like some things that we have in our government in the United States. In fact, it became a republic in 509 BC, and that lasted for 450 years before it became an empire. The country flourished during that time, but as a military and political figures of that government assumed more and more power, this led to the beginning of an empire. Have you ever wondered in our country why we're concerned about the 3 different branches of government and there being checks and balances? Well, go back and study the history of Rome. Some of these people who were in power became so powerful that they literally took over the whole government, and thus it became an empire of Caesars. The Roman Empire came to power in Palestine in 63 BC. Civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey occurred from 49 to 45. Julius became the Roman emperor in 46 BC. He was killed 2 years later in 44 BC. Mark Antony and Octavian, the grandnephew of Julius, defeated the assassins of Julius Caesar, and this led to years of struggle for power between these men from 42 to 31 BC. Octavian won the struggle and ultimately became the Caesar that you know as Augustus Caesar. Question, where do you know Augustus Caesar? Well, he was the guy who was the Caesar from 27 BC to AD 14. Hello? The very time when Jesus Christ was born. It was during this time that the Jews threw off Roman dominion from 40 to 37 BC. They were reconquered, and Antipater's son, Herod the Great, was made the king of the Jews. Now you got another guy we know about in the New Testament, Herod the Great. And as I mentioned, Augustus was the emperor when Jesus was born. There's a lot of things about the Herods. Don't want to talk about that much tonight. But Herod the Great is a guy that's very important because he ruled from 37 BC to 4 BC. Augustus chose him to be the ruler over Judea, and here was a guy who was constantly trying to kill everybody he saw as a threat to his power. No wonder when he heard about there's a king of the Jews coming, you know what happened early at Jesus' birth, you began to understand some things about that. Uh, Herod divided the land of Israel into three parts, and his sons were given those territories. And I'll not mention those for time tonight, but that gets us down to the time of Jesus. But folks, here's the importance of the Roman Empire. The Romans, number one, left the rule of law and order. That was very, very important. There was a sense of law and order like never before in the world. And that was important to the first century. Number two, they built a massive highway system that connected Rome, way over here in the west, all the way to the ends of the empire in the east, all the way through Palestine. Now think what that does to assist the spread of Christianity. This all was critical to the spread of Christianity quickly in the first century. Have you ever asked yourself, I don't get it, how in the world could Christianity grow so fast? Well, can I use a phrase? Because the fullness of time had now come. There's some Jewish sects that arose. I'm only going to mention these for time. You know a couple of them well. The Pharisees. The Pharisees were the outgrowth of that Hasidim, those people who were so violently opposed to Antiochus Epiphanes and the influence of him upon the temple, etc. However, the Pharisees were kind of like they were ordinary Jews, but they strongly resisted Greek culture and its influence. They said, we're the separated ones. We don't want to have any of this Greek influence upon us in our lives. They demanded respect for and submission to the law. And they didn't want anything around them that was going to corrupt the Jewish religion or adherence to the law of Moses. Now, on the flip side, you have the Sadducees. Who are the Sadducees? Well, they were mainly made up of priests and aristocrats. They cooperated with the Seleucids and the Romans. And most of them were Hellenists. That is, they opened their arms to Greek culture. They wanted the nation to accept Greek culture and its ways. And in the first century, when you and I read about the Sadducees, well, we kind of know something about their beliefs. I'll get there in a second. But when you talk about the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees really almost control the Sanhedrin. That is kind of like the Supreme Court of the land. The Sadducees believed in God and the law, but they rejected most of the traditions and the interpretations of the Pharisees, and they were rationalists of the day. If they couldn't see it, they didn't believe it. Therefore, they didn't believe in the existence of the afterlife. They didn't believe in the supernatural, so they didn't believe in angels or immortality or rewards or punishment or future life or eternal life. They didn't believe in any of that stuff. Two other groups you might have heard about. One of them is the Essenes. There were some Jews who simply said, we're going to withdraw from society. We're going to go out and start our own monastic community. We're going to have our own monastic lifestyle. We're not going to let anything from outside influence us. They shared property in common. They ate at a common table. They were vegetarians. They abhorred filth in any form. They wore white clothes to symbolize purity. And by the way, how many of you remember stories about things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you've heard about Qumran and the Qumran community that was out there outside of Jericho? It just looked like sandy hills, and it was in some of those that some of the shepherds found some of those Dead Sea Scrolls. That was an area controlled by the Essenes. And then the other groups, the Zealots I mentioned, who were so violently opposed to any kind of domination of any country in Palestine and their land. And just stop, if I may, and make an observation. Some of you can go back 80 years and think about where countries have come in and been war and have been over a country, but a lot of you can't. So let me see if I can give one or two. You remember when the Iraq War occurred? And there were some people in Iraq that wanted the United States there. But did you notice what happened after 2 or 3 years? It doesn't take long when an army from another country comes in that people in their country say, we don't want you here, get out, we want our own country. Well, folks, that's where the Jews had been, and I'll talk in just a few moments about how long. During this time, the moral conditions of the Gentile world were idolatrous worship, divorce, abortion and infanticide, prostitution, adultery, and despair was rampant. When God said the fullness of time has come, there was a time in the world when the world needed a Savior. Secondly, there were traits of the Jews that blessed the world. They believed in God. They had the Old Testament Scriptures, which now not only are in Hebrew, but also are in Koine Greek, and so everybody who speaks the language can see it. The synagogue had become a place of worship and of Bible study mostly, and they rejected idols and idolatry and idol gods. So that's kind of where we are when we get down to the time of the birth of Jesus. Now, let me stop here and talk just about 4 or 5 things that are important in this study tonight. Number one, when you look at the lessons from the intertestamental period, it is no wonder that the Jews had such an intense longing for a Messiah. And by the way, many of the Lord's own disciples, His apostles, what kind of Messiah were they looking for? Y'all know. They were looking for an earthly ruler who's going to do what? Who's going to throw off the dominion of Rome. Well, why would they have such intense feelings like that? Folks, they'd been under the dominion of other nations for almost 800 years. They just want to have their own land. The Jews were looking for that king to cast off Rome's dominion. And so, think about these statements in the New Testament. The wise men came and asked, "Where is he who's born King of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east and come to worship him." We're looking for the King of the Jews. Nathanael, like many Jews, was looking for a Messiah who would overthrow Rome in John chapter 1, verse 49. "Rabbi, you're the Son of God." Watch this. "You're the King of the Jews." Pilate asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" So you see this idea when the Lord's here, the impact of Jews wanting freedom. The Jewish leaders didn't see him as a deliverer from Rome. They saw him as a false claimant. I'll not give a lot of scriptures about that tonight, but you know the Jewish leaders claimed that Jesus was a fraud. Why did they see him as a fraud? He wasn't what they wanted. They wanted an earthly king. His apostles were still confused just before he ascended back to heaven in Acts 1 and verse 6. Remember what they said? "Lord, will you again at this time restore the kingdom again to Israel?" But you know that Jesus himself never hinted about being an earthly king. Remember when he stood before Pilate, and Pilate asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus there emphasized, "My kingdom is not of this world. I didn't come here to have an earthly kingdom." Secondly, tonight, when I look at this intertestamental time, how sad it is when revelation goes totally silent. Can you think tonight what it was like in the land of Jerusalem, where they'd had prophets, Habakkuk, Malachi, and now all of a sudden they don't have any revelation. There's no prophet. Without revelation, some became civil zealots. Without revelation, some became naturalists. Without revelation, some became hermits and monastics. And without revelation, some went beyond God's law and became legalistic and despised everybody in every other nation. Without revelation, just like in the days of the book of Judges, every man does what's right in his own eyes. I hope tonight you appreciate the fact that we live in a time when revelation's been given and is completed and we have it. I hope you cherish it. Thirdly, in this study tonight, you see the amazing providence of God. Yes, the Babylonians became the empire that controlled all 12 of the tribes. This enabled believers to be under the same dominion. It was no longer the 10 tribes under Assyria and the 2 under Babylon. The Medo-Persians were humane people in that second empire. The Medo-Persians treated the Jews with honor and respect. They showed them respect, and as we've studied in the last 2 or 3 lessons, Cyrus showed clemency to these captured enemies and allowed them to observe their own worship practices while they're in captivity. Not only that, he had a policy of allowing captives to return back to their homelands and encouraged Ezra and Nehemiah to take the Jews who wanted to go and to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, and to rebuild the walls. The Greeks under Alexander the Great were determined to spread Greek culture all over the world, but think of the impact of the Koine Greek becoming vital, the language of the common people, the Bible, the message of God being placed in a book that all of these people could read and understand. And the Romans, in the massive highway system, the rule of law and order, crucial to the spread of Christianity in the first century. Their legal system was important because it gave protection for those who were hated by religious bigots. They still had some protection to worship as they chose to worship. Now, would you turn to Daniel 2 with me? Daniel 2. We read some of this earlier, but Daniel 2, starting at verse 40. Here's what God said about that fourth empire. The fourth empire shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of a lion shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with the ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. And as you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Daniel, what are you talking about? In the days of this fourth great empire, the Roman Empire, the God of heaven is going to set up a kingdom that's greater than all four of these empires, because it's going to be a divine kingdom. It's going to be what you and I today know as the church, that's going to last as long as the world stands. No kingdom, no world is going to overthrow it, because God is in control of it and the ruler of it. Number 4 observation tonight, and I want to simply go back to where I started. Christ came when God said, the fullness of time has come. Remember Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4? When the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law. God said, right now is the right time to send Jesus into the world. And you look at all those events that we've talked about tonight that took those Jews from captivity to Christ. It's amazing. The succeeding captors brought easier circumstances. The benevolent Persians allowed them to go back home. The Greek culture and the Roman culture, and all the impact of that, bringing it down to the right time. Last point tonight. The great message. God is saying the time for the Messiah is here. That's why it's so important when you and I open up the book of Matthew or Mark or Luke or John and read about the birth of Jesus. It's not just reading a piece of history that happened 2,000 years ago. It's reading God saying, this is what it's all about. This is what I've had planned before the world began. Now I bring the Messiah to the world. In our next study, we'll turn to the birth of Jesus Christ. This evening, these are things that you and I don't talk about a lot. But I hope you stop and think about the amazing power and wisdom and providence of God, and how important that is in these 400 years of silence. tonight we extend the Lord's invitation. And if you need forgiveness, you need prayers, you need love, anything we can do for you, would you come while we stand and sing?